Hi, everybody. Good evening, and welcome to Need to Impeach, a conversation with Shahid Buttar. He's a candidate running in California's 12th congressional district against Nancy Pelosi. This is Shahid. Hi, Shahid. Thank you for being here.
Hi, John. Thanks so much for having me.
Yes. Excited about this. I think a lot of us are. And of course, Laura is here, and she's going to be in chat taking questions, which we will address afterwards. However, I have a pretty good list of questions. Laura's going to drop those in the chat so you can see where I'm headed here. We've got a lot to talk about, right? Because today was pretty crazy. Yesterday was pretty crazy, and I'm just gonna take it into just a summary, not even a summary, just to where I'm at with this. All right, Shahid, because I don't think I'm unintelligent, but I'm definitely confused about a lot of the things that I'm seeing with the way centrist Dems are responding to this. Progressives in some sides, Republicans. I don't know if the Mueller report is important to impeachment or not. And my real question is, even if I feel as an American citizen that impeachment is necessary just for like the keeping of democracy, all right, based on previous times we've gone that direction, right?
Yeah.
Is it even possible? So I just want to start off with why impeach, and then we're going to dive into that. So please.
So why impeach?
Yeah, why in the first place do you feel it's necessary to impeach?
Yeah, it's a constitutional imperative, and it's critical to particularly guard checks and balances. Our constitutional design is a very elaborate set of checks and balances between different branches and across different levels of government. And if Congress doesn't impeach, it is effectively inviting criminality from the White House. Failing to impeach, and this is one of the reasons I'm running, frankly, because I see the tactical weakness of the Democratic establishment that by choosing not to impeach, effectively emboldens our kleptocrat in chief. It invites further abuses of our Constitution, of the American people, of working families, of future generations, of the earth. And frankly, we need to be pulling every lever available to us. That's through a constitutional lens. There's a whole other reason to impeach, which I would describe as a partisan rationale, which is simply to say, there is a Republican president in the White House. He is a threat to all of our values, particularly the values of his own supporters.
Sure.
Let's just be clear about that. And from a partisan angle, for Democrats to force the president to be called to account, to justify his actions, particularly on emoluments, to make this about corruption in the GOP, there is both a constitutional imperative to guard the integrity of the republic and a partisan opportunity to embolden opportunities for Democrats to appear to the American people like we are doing our jobs, as opposed to laying down and falling asleep at the switch while a corrupt administration continues to fleece the country.
Yeah, that is important. Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you hit on that. You hit on a couple of things that we're gonna address. It seems like I'm just gonna go here. We'll just go here. Paraphrasing Glenn Greenwald on that. I agree with you that it's kind of an imperative morally for the Democrats to go this direction, for democracy to exist at all. It seems like we have to. 3 years, and this is Glenn's sort of words, the Democrats have just been hounding on Trump, and regardless of whether it's collusion with the Russians or whatnot, what a horrible man. But now it seems like they've been given what appears to be an awful lot of evidence to work with, and they don't want to. Why is that?
Yeah, I mean, the idea that resistance would be reduced to a hashtag is very offensive to me. Under the Bush administration, when I was in Washington as a young lawyer, I've co-founded a grassroots group called the Resistance Media Collective, and we were messaging to press outlets grassroots resistance actions challenging Bush's wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as corporate resource extraction, corporate globalization. That was resistance, right? There is a difference between resistance and dissent. And by laying down on impeachment, Democrats are abandoning resistance to reduce themselves to dissent. Dissent is important. I spent my career defending dissent and rights to it and promoting it, sharpening it. I think dissent is critically important. I, as a citizen, am committed to it. When you're in Congress, you have a job to do
Whoops.
And particularly the
This is real life, everybody. This is real life. All right. This isn't staged on CNN. It's all right.
Not a wardrobe malfunction.
No, hey, it's still better than the dog drinking the coffee. All right. Always. Continue where you were. Apologies.
I quite frankly can't remember.
That's
exactly
all right. You were on it. I mean, you were basically just talking about the fact that we need to do it. And you mentioned emoluments, regardless of the Russian narrative that's been pushed, and that one has got me very confused. But talk about this. So why emoluments have been ignored mostly by Democrats? Why?
And I think it's the strongest ground to impeach. You know, the Emoluments Clause is the prohibition on the president to enrich himself through office. And that's all this president is doing. The entire administration is a sustained exercise in self-enrichment for a corrupt president. And, you know, I'd use very simple examples to illustrate this. Every time he goes to play golf at one of his resorts and he drags along a Secret Service entourage that is paying private market rates for rooms at his expensive resorts, putting money directly in his pocket from taxpayers. Every time he hosts an international summit in one of his properties and then is billing foreign dignitaries and using the pull of his own office to extract that wealth from them, basically using his office as a bargaining chip to put money in his pocket and those of his kids. It's gross. Yeah. It's illegal. It's unconstitutional. And for Democrats not to use it as a basis for impeachment, frankly, as the primary basis for impeachment, is effectively condoning that kind of public theft. And whatever your values, whatever your ideology, wherever you fall on the political spectrum, one value that at least used to unite the American people is that our officials should not be fleecing us. And I do think that making that the primary ground for impeachment could be an effective way to particularly call into sharper focus not only the violations of the Emoluments Clause, but all of the administration's various assaults on the rule of law. And I think there have been any number. Frankly, I think the president's lies to the American people are independently impeachable, separate from the Emoluments Clause. And there have been about 1 million of those. So, like, you know, pick your target, basically. It'd be like shooting fish in a barrel, frankly.
Well, but lies have become standard, because if the media starts to do more than just say, well, he lied, then everybody gets. It seems like everybody knows they're caught here, and nobody wants to just go to the end game, you know?
I feel like part of what you're describing is that there is a dynamic, particularly among press outlets and editors, of treating this administration as if they were deer,
yes,
staring in headlights. And yes. The fact of the matter is, you know, press outlets don't have to be reduced to stenography. There is an ethic in journalism that is about speaking truth to power, examining lies, and calling them out. And I think the recent decision by the AP, for instance, to name racism, instead of, you know, dancing around this, they said, you know, false equivalence kind of notion. I think that's an important act of leadership in journalism, in a profession, frankly, that needs more acts of leadership. I go back, you know, it's 15 years ago now that the New York Times swung the 2004 election for Bush by failing to report on a story it had about the mass surveillance regime that Bush began illegally, in secret, and unconstitutionally, in violation of a statute, constitutional restrictions, any number of other legal authorities. And in that case, you know, it's really striking to see the willingness of publishers not to publish newsworthy facts at the insistence of political actors. And I think that it reflects the threat to press freedom through non-legal channels. That's a market-based, ultimately, restriction. And I think we have to be really careful before we allow some of the engines of democracy to slip through our fingers. And I think a free and active, independent press is a crucial ingredient in our constitutional recipe.
Man, I can't agree more. And that's an entire other live stream event where you and I talk about what do we do to restore integrity. Because while I'm pretty happy with the thriving independent media scene on the internet, I couldn't say the same for what you get on mainstream media. You know,
right.
It's horrific, and it's done more damage to me. It's done more damage than any individual politician ever could. It's horrific, right?
And it's degraded our discourse. You know,
yes.
I think the polity has been harmed as a result. Our capacity to examine truth, to see through lies, to challenge this kind of corruption has become eroded for other reasons, precisely because the press has been largely reduced over the last generation to merely printing government officials, you know, granting anonymity, to White House officials when they're rebutting claims by whistleblowers, for instance, basically allowing administration officials the opportunity to punch down with impunity. That violates a journalistic ethic, but you see major press publications practice it all the time. I particularly see this through the lens of the treatment of whistleblowers. And this isn't just a Trump problem. Unfortunately, corporate Democrats, when they were in office in the last administration, were actively participating in attacks on the press, escalating the attack on press freedom that began under the Bush administration. It got worse under Obama, and now it's potentially worse under Trump. Frankly, by the statistics, it was worse under Obama than it has been under Trump. I think that's something that Democrats should be very disturbed by. And I think that we need to turn a corner there. We have to recommit ourselves to fundamental liberties, and they include the freedom of the press and the opportunity for the public to hear about the allegations and findings of conscientious public servants who do the right thing, even at the cost of their careers. And that's one reason why I'm particularly excited about Senator Gravel's presence in the presidential race, because he's the last member of Congress to really go to bat for whistleblowers and do the right thing by practicing that transparency. I see the all too willing, corporate Democrats today are all too willing to sacrifice that kind of transparency, to abdicate their constitutional responsibility to the American public, to shake the trees and unearth the fact. And even when presented with opportunities, for better or worse, they run screaming from them. It's another reason why I think the incoming freshmen, the new progressive class, is so exciting, because they do, in the oversight context, exactly what you're supposed to do, which is to say, ask hard questions instead of grandstanding and making statements for the cameras, which is most of what oversight's been reduced.
Absolutely. And there, you see, beautifully said. Yeah, I want to just back up to talking about why the Dems won't actually push for it, in particular Nancy Pelosi. And there's a quote here. This is Glenn Greenwald after Speaker rejects impeachment. Does Putin have dirt on Pelosi? I think Glenn's being a little funny there, but Pelosi says, "I'm not for impeachment," and her words are that it would be divisive to the country. Don't you think the president is already I don't even know how to take that.
That is the point. No, I mean, exactly, right? It's such a weak concession.
Yes.
To think that it's impeachment instead of the president's crimes against the public that are divisive. Resigning impeachment is like unilateral disarmament. And I do think it's important to internalize that it is an active act of acquiescence that invites more of the same. And the calculus surrounding it, the supposedly partisan justification for resigning impeachment, if you listen to corporate Democrats, is that by leaving Trump in office, they're going to have an easier target in 2020. I would just remind everyone that was exactly the thinking that put Trump in office in the first place. It was corporate Democrats building him vis-a-vis the other Republican primary candidates in the 2018 cycle, thinking that he would be an easier target, and then ultimately getting taken to the cleaners by him. It seems that corporate Democrats learned very little, and they didn't learn what they should have from the 2016, presidential primary cycle and the results of the general election, putting Trump, leaving him in office on the thinking that he is so horrific that the American people will, by default, choose the other alternative, however centrist it might be, is a recipe for disaster. It is ducking into a punch. It is a failed strategy that has already failed, even before we started this cycle. And it would be the height of imbecility, frankly, to embrace it again.
Absolutely. And it would be worse this time because they're pushing Joe Biden currently. And he scores lower than Hillary.
I mean, nominating Biden would be effectively like just giving the election to Trump. We have to be honest about that. But Biden can't mobilize traditional Democratic bases. There are two in particular that are really crucial for Democrats. One is women and one is African Americans. Biden was the author of the crime bill under the Clinton administration that filled our jails and prisons. He is as much an architect of mass incarceration, even more so than Senator Kamala Harris, right? It's almost as if one of the requirements to be a corporate Democratic presidential candidate is that you be up to your neck in mass incarceration. Joe Biden is no less than any other among those candidates. His role in ensuring that a generation of students would be effectively indentured to their student debt by denying them the opportunity to seek the same bankruptcy relief that commercial industries and corporations routinely do when they make, business decisions that don't work out. A bankruptcy protection that the president has availed himself of on multiple projects, right? The discrimination against young people that that Vice President Biden embraced, and as well as his concessions under the Obama administration to the banking industry, his concessions under the Obama administration to the pharmaceutical industry. He is an icon of corporate rule and the policing industrial prison slavery complex. And I don't think he can mobilize those parts of the Democratic base. Let's look at women. These are bad Freudian slips to make.
I know. Please stop saying that.
No, I can't. President Sanders is what is the more default name that rolls off my tongue. But Joe Biden is grabby. He is creepy. He doesn't know his boundaries, and he's unrepentant about it. And that last piece in particular, to me, is especially offensive. I mean, it would be one thing if called out for, a pattern of behavior that, maybe like we see in shows like Mad Men, was generationally accepted at one point, and the world is in a different place. Maybe if he was thoughtful about it and apologized and suggested some way in which he'd learned and evolved, that would be plausible. But to simply say that he has done nothing wrong, even though any number of people have come forward and said they felt uncomfortable and he was abusing his power as a man to insist upon physical proximity and intimacy with people, even in public settings. I mean, frankly, it's preposterous. And you look at some of the videos of him grabbing like little girls and whatnot. I mean, I don't understand what's come over Democrats to think that he could possibly in any world be a viable candidate. He's been a candidate for the presidency multiple times, and he's never come close. And so to think that he is somehow going to be the white knight to save us from Trump it's absurd, frankly. I mean, it would be funny if it weren't so disturbing and problematic, because it could very well resign the rest of us to 4 more years of racism run amok and xenophobia.
But we don't have that. I mean, you and I both know we don't have that, right? We've got climate crisis to deal with, and so I want to take what you just said, and I'm going to make it even more depressing. I had a question in here that was, can we actually make this happen, impeachment, with the GOP? But honestly, I think they're easier. The question should be, can we make this happen with the current Dem Party?
Yes.
Because Joe Biden really is on Trump's side with many things, all things mostly. And so how can it happen?
So the key is to initiate it, first of all. This gets to your point.
Okay.
As long as centrist Democrats hold the keys and can prevent it from beginning, and that's, what Pelosi has done to this point, is prevent the impeachment train from even leaving the station, we can be very sure that we can't effectuate it. But once it initiates, a bunch of things happen. The very first thing that happens is that every news story reporting on anything relating to the administration will have to note that it is undergoing the process of being potentially removed from office by Congress. That shift in every news cycle will generate sustained attention to, even if the Senate refuses to proceed, the alleged criminality, corruption, and assault on the rule of law being practiced by the White House. That news cycle and its recurrence, its sustainability across time until the impeachment train reaches whatever station it reaches, will in itself create a lot of, and I hesitate to use the word here, but I think from a partisan lens, it's appropriate to say opportunities, because whether or not the Senate proceeds, if impeachment proceedings if the articles of impeachment are filed by the House, and then the Senate goes through the process, it could very well create political risks for GOP senators who refuse to stand up and do the right thing. This is about calling for accountability and being unwilling to seek accountability because we don't see the votes yet, right? Pelosi is practicing the tactic that's worked very well for her in the House. She's counting the votes and she doesn't see them, so she's not going to start. But the fact of the matter here is it is a process that will take very many months. And it's important to go through the process because the process will build the consensus to repudiate corruption, to require transparency, to pursue and confirm the articles of impeachment, to remove this kleptocrat from office. And I mean, think of this even from the personal political opportunistic lens of the speaker. This could put Nancy Pelosi in the White House if she were simply willing to exercise her powers. And
That's scary.
frankly, I think, again, whether it's through a constitutional lens, a partisan lens, or even just a personal lens for the speaker, so many things suggest proceeding. And the only thing, frankly, in its way, is a commitment to status quo inertia inside the Beltway. And we know that a commitment to the Beltway before the country is what delivered us to this place. It's why so much of the country felt abandoned under previous administrations. It's what created the disaffection that allowed Trump to sell his corrupt wares to an unsuspecting public that now is being fleeced by it. And I think it's crucial that we have our leaders consider the principles at stake, not just their own narrow constructions of a limited history.
All right. So you say the process, just going through the process, is a catalyst for opportunity to make things happen, right? To out some people or whatnot. Nancy Pelosi isn't interested in that. Is she the true gatekeeper here? Do we have to slay that dragon to move forward, or is there something we can do?
She is at least the closest thing to a singular decision maker. It could be the case that if the Progressive Caucus and some of the other caucuses in the House were able to unite and basically force that question, what that would look like effectively is a challenge to the speakership. So at the end of the day, the Speaker of the House is the most individually empowered person to proceed here. And without her support, it will be very difficult to make impeachment move. The House is notoriously centralized in terms of the body's institutional influence being wielded effectively by the Speaker. It's one reason why the Speaker of the House is one of the most powerful people in government. There aren't many other branches, except for the presidency, where a single individual embodies the institutional power of a branch of government. It's not true on the Supreme Court. It's not true in the Senate. It's just the House and the executive branch that have that sort of personified authority.
Yeah.
And it is very much, again, the Speaker's constitutional, not just opportunity, but I do want to make this point, constitutional responsibility.
Agreed.
To take advantage of the Mueller report, to pursue the facts with respect to emolument, to initiate the investigations that will lead to the discovery of the facts that will make the public case for impeachment. When we look at the Mueller report, a lot of it's been misrepresented, particularly because Attorney General Barr was misrepresenting it in public before anybody else saw it. But the Mueller report, properly understood, is an invitation to impeachment, at least on a set of grounds. I think that the emoluments clause is the more important thing on which to focus. But we should see the Mueller report in that context as an invitation to the House to frankly show up for work and do its job, and then to put it to the Senate. And if GOP senators aren't going to follow the facts, if they're going to demonstrate a political favoritism and look the other way while the president is engaged in sustained criminality, well, then put that before the American people and force them on the record, because those will be decisions, frankly, that Democratic candidates for Senate can run against those GOP senators for. But the only way you get that is if you file the articles of impeachment and you force them to cast the votes. So, I think Pelosi's reticence here is more than simply weak. It is unfortunately unacceptable. And I think we really have to make sure that we do better, whether for, to protect the republic, to, challenge the GOP or merely to challenge kleptocracy, if that's the goal.
Well, I mean, to me, just looking at it from a regular old guy outside of it, she's just protecting herself and her friends, and she knows that some of them are going to go down when this goes down, if it goes down. And here's where it gets amazing. I wouldn't think it would be possible to get her to move on this, but I mean, look, you got Ryan Knight, Mr. Proud Resistor himself, saying, look, I'm not attacking, because of course he wouldn't attack one of his heroes. I'm not attacking Speaker Pelosi or Rep. Jerry Nadler. I'm just asking them to do their job they were elected to do, which is to defend the Constitution. Just because GOP refuses to uphold their oath does not mean it's okay for our leaders to do the same. Impeach Trump. So do you think we can put enough public pressure on our own people, because it seems like centrists and progressives are united here, to force them, maybe to force action?
I hope so. I mean, in the same way that impeachment is the accountability mechanism that Congress has over the White House, the accountability mechanism that we, the people, have over the House are elections. And that's why I'm running, because I think the failure of the Speaker of the House is frankly disqualifying. And I think that
Right.
San Francisco deserves and demands a bolder alternative that is willing to defend the Constitution, that is willing to defend our communities. You know, to the extent we are in a Sanders administration after 2020 and I am in the House, you know, at that point, impeachment becomes moot because Trump will be out of office already. I don't think we can necessarily presume that for the purposes of laying down on impeachment. Right? I would certainly favor impeachment if, through whatever quirk of horrendous fate, the Trump administration survives the 2020 election and I have the opportunity in Congress to oppose it and mount real resistance. My entire career has been about real resistance. You know, under the Bush administration, I was in the street, I was organizing mass demonstrations, I was filing court cases, I was leading nonprofits, I was, you know, pushing legislation, I was speaking in the House, I was getting arrested in the Senate for acts of journalism. Like, we have to mount real resistance. And what that means is creatively engaging our action opportunities to force the questions that aren't being answered to at least get asked. And part of what I see as disqualifying is the Democrats' presumption that because they think their questions won't get answered, they're not going to bother asking them in the first place. And again, that's a sure way to that's one way to ensure that impeachment doesn't get confirmed, is simply not to begin in the first place. But I think we really have to make sure that we put our every foot forward and pursue every strategy to see what sticks. That's the essence of resistance, is to mount it at every level.
All right, so let's presume that we can make it happen, and somehow AOC and Ilhan get together and they get Nancy in a back room and they're like, "You're gonna do this," and she's like, "Fine," and so she comes out and says, "I reluctantly agree to impeach." Now, so what happens next? What does the process look like? And here's the question that about 900 people have asked in chat: what about Pence?
Right. So let's talk about just Pence in the first place. So the 12th Amendment, which changed the process for presidential elections to ensure that back in the day, at the early parts of the Republic, the vice president was just the runner-up for the presidential election. Whoever didn't get first place, whoever got second place, became the vice president. And that meant that within administrations, you had hostility between presidents and vice presidents. And sometimes that hostility got really sharp. I mean, a president has accused a vice president, a sitting vice president, of treason in the past. And the 12th Amendment aimed to address that by allowing the president and the vice president to be nominated on a single ticket. But that had very crucial implications for impeachment, because in the past, in the original vision of the constitutional design, if you impeach the president, the vice president who would take that person's place would likely be an opposition figure, not the designated alternative should, for instance, like a health calamity befall the president. So the change in the structure of the vice presidency with the 12th Amendment had very crucial implications for impeachment, which is to say, if you impeach the president, in the era after the 12th Amendment, you know, my impression is that the vice president necessarily should go to, if only because they were nominated together. And it would be the height of perversity for the same party to benefit from the corruption for which one of its leaders is being held accountable. So I certainly think that Pence should be included in the articles of impeachment. You know, one thing we haven't discussed here, but is important to recognize, even if impeachment isn't ultimately confirmed by the Senate, the mere process that it would embroil the administration in, which is quasi-judicial and would, you know, involve witnesses and then effectively a proceeding in the Senate that would take, again, many months, it would politically hamstring this administration. It would prevent it from pursuing any of the sordid acts that it is at the moment at liberty to pursue, precisely because corporate Democrats won't force effectively the president to stand the constitutional equivalent of trial. There's a interesting eddy worth chasing here. The Mueller report, one of the headlines with respect to the Mueller report, when the Attorney General first misrepresented it in public, was the summary notion that Bob Mueller recommended not indicting the president. And that's not true. Bob Mueller stopped short of examining indictment because the Justice Department under Trump and under previous presidents held that you couldn't indict a sitting president for garden variety crimes. And this is a precedent that stems back from the Clinton administration. And faced with either dealing with that or merely giving Congress the facts that it would need to proceed with its own accountability proceedings separate from the criminal justice system. Impeachment is not a criminal process. It's a quasi it's an accountability process, but not a criminal one through the Article 3 courts. It goes through Congress instead. Mueller was basically meeting the political moment and the legal moment where it is, which is to say giving Congress the tools and the facts it would need to proceed with impeachment and not chasing the red herring of a criminal indictment that the Justice Department would be reticent to pursue, not only because Attorney General Barr is in a very corrupt fashion acting like the president's personal attorney, but also because the Justice Department institutionally has been committed to this reading of the law that prohibits or precludes, let's say, the prosecution of a sitting president.
Right. All right. Let's talk about that for a minute. You just mentioned Barr and quite an explosion in the last 2 days.
Yes.
I mean, so we know that most of these people in there are liars, and they all lie about a lot of stuff. But he's now been caught lying, and they seem to care about this particular lie. Other lies they don't care about, but this one a lot of people seem to care about his particular lies. So what happens there? Can we get rid of him or?
So I might push back on the principle that most of them are lying all the time. There are certainly a lot of lies that get thrown about in Washington. I can't say if it's more or less than half, but entirely too many lies have been
based on votes. Yeah, I just go based on vote record, but you're right.
Well, I mean, I can never pass up an opportunity to kick the CIA in the shins, but if we want to talk about liars with impunity, there's an agency full of them.
Well, okay, wait a minute. That's a great point. Because my question also applies to, let's take that to the FBI, see?
Sure.
So we have a question of trust there, right? And I think that is, as an American, I don't trust the FBI. So how much do I trust this information that's in this report? And I've got to consider that, right? And,
I mean, the government intelligence agencies have for decades, for multiple generations, been engaged in a sustained attack on the constitutional rights of Americans. And most Americans don't necessarily know that. If they do know the history of the COINTELPRO era, they falsely presume that it ever ended,
right,
in the face of evidence to the contrary, suggesting that. I was actually at May Day at an International Workers' Day celebration earlier today, speaking with a longtime Puerto Rican independence activist who was describing how in his community it was very obvious that COINTELPRO never ended. If you think COINTELPRO ended, I'd invite you to ask Angela Davis or maybe go find Tupac Shakur and ask them if that ever ended. I particularly see it through the lens of the crackdown on animal rights and peace activists that began in the Clinton administration, continued through Bush. The attacks on what the FBI now calls Black identity extremists, which is to say participants in the movement for Black lives under the Obama administration and now Trump. People, a lot of liberals, centrists generally, were rah FBI for the last 3 years, and frankly it turned my stomach because the FBI is the agency that was trying to drive Dr. King to an early demise. It was the agency that was raiding union activists and labor activists 100 years ago. The FBI has always been a politicized institution, and it's never been a progressive one.
Right.
Same is true of the CIA. The CIA not only has been toppling democratically elected governments around the world, turning hearts and minds against the American people for decades, importing crack cocaine into U.S. cities, subjecting generations to a eviscerating not only drug market, but then the paramilitarized war on drugs that the CIA effectively contrived by starting all that. We haven't even started talking yet about torturing detainees or pioneering new forms of human rights abuses in the form of remote robots that vaporize even U.S. citizens based on their speech without charge or trial. I mean, the CIA is in a class of criminality unto itself. I think it is probably, among the it is one of the worst institutions in the world from the standpoint of protecting versus degrading human rights. And I don't even know how he got off on the intelligence agencies, but just the fact of lies across Washington.
Right. Well, we're talking about lies, and I was just saying, look, it brings up a trust issue when you've got an agency that has done horrible things, yet you need to look at the evidence in this report. And I'm not, for me, I can sit there and balance the two and know that, bad people also create good stuff. But, I think it causes confusion with the American people because and then you've got the narrative coming out of corporate media, which is, I don't even know what it is at this point, right? So
I want to say one thing about that, just to try to address that at that level of abstraction.
Please.
We, the American people, are currently being fought over by a series of anti-democratic, corrupt institutions. On the one hand, you have right-wing populism and kleptocracy. That's the Trump administration. On the other hand, you have institutional corruption and the military industrial corruption of the sort that Eisenhower warned us to fear. That's the intelligence agencies, and for better or worse, most of the Democratic Party. And when you look at Pelosi's reticence to pull the impeachment trigger through this lens, you see essentially a creature of Washington standing down to allow that same institutional inertia to proceed, deferring to the system and the establishment, which transcends party. That's a key thing to recognize here, that because corporations and corporate rule has co-opted both parties, that the illusion of contention between them is often a veneer contrived for a public audience. But all of this reputation that Nancy Pelosi has attained over the 6 months of supposedly opposing the president because she refused to adopt his corrupt physical border wall, it presumed entirely too much, because at the very same time, before resigning impeachment, Nancy Pelosi was marching in lockstep with Trump on foreign policy from Venezuela to the West Bank, going after Ilhan Omar, a member of her own caucus, essentially to protect the president politically. She similarly adopted fiscal austerity rules favored and insisted upon by Republicans, fiscal austerity rules that effectively unilaterally disarmed the Progressive Caucus and the opportunity for the House to pursue deficit spending to meet the needs of the American people. On one issue after another, she has not merely failed to effectuate a progressive end, she has failed to seek a progressive end and has actively enabled a conservative one. And I think that's a reality that is unfortunately only apparent if you look past the news cycle and you examine the facts very closely. I know most Americans don't have the luxury or the inclination to do that. As a candidate, my job is to educate the electorate here in San Francisco and make sure that, to the extent people don't know, and I think they do know generally, that the Speaker of the House is not representing our city, is not representing working people in our city, is not representing future generations, and ultimately is doing entirely too many things to undermine each of working families, San Franciscans, and future generations, not to mention our planet.
That was a powerful lead into what you just mentioned, research. As I was putting together the content for this, I was looking at something. I read a lot of Intercept, Glenn Greenwald, and
you should. Intercept is great.
They're one of the few entities I donate to, actually. And there's this. So he was talking about the whole, how come Nancy Pelosi is not doing anything, and there's this piece written in 2018. The same Democrats who denounced Donald Trump as lawless, treasonous, authoritarian just voted to give him vast warrantless spying powers. And what it references, which is insane, is this. Joining the pro-surveillance coalition led by Trump, Paul Ryan, Devin Nunes, it goes on. Basically, thanks to Pelosi, they were able to defeat, this is Paul Ryan saying, I want to thank Pelosi for coming up and speaking against the Amash Amendment and in favor of the underlying bipartisan bill, which basically gave the NSA just continued their outrageous abuse of spying powers, right? So Nancy has a history of this.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm so glad that you raised this discrete issue, because you were literally seizing on the precise discrete issue that prompted me to run for Congress in 2018. Great. It was the vote over proposed surveillance reform in the spring of 2018 that Pelosi undermined that prompted me effectively to go from my job as an advocate seeking limits on government surveillance to then challenge in the electoral sphere the strongest woman on the planet. And even if we rewind the tape longer than that, this pattern of complicity in Republican human rights abuses is entirely all too well established. Nancy Pelosi, under the Bush administration, voted repeatedly to fund his illegal wars of neo-imperial, let's say, commercial conquest. She, under the Bush administration, affirmatively helped the CIA effectuate its continuing cover-up of its international human rights violations in the context of torturing detainees. In each of these instances, whether it's voting for wars and continuing to fund them, I heard a veteran say to me once, this is someone in Vets for Bernie, a group that endorsed me in the 2018 cycle, I'm proud to have their support. He said to me that within the community of conscious veterans, there is an awareness that Nancy Pelosi refused to let the troops come home under the Bush administration. And then the first time I heard that, I did a double take and I was like, can you say that again? And that is the implication of continuing to fund wars that the American people oppose and that aren't untenable. And we are in now Afghanistan for the longest amount of time that we have ever been engaged in a conflict around the world. And there is no end there in sight. And I feel like the unwillingness of Democrats to stand up for the interests of their base, to stand up for human rights, to stand up for the transparency that their own partisan interests would suggest is a reflection not only of weakness, but ultimately, and this gets to your point, co-optation. And I think that's ultimately why we need to flip the script and flip some of these seats, not just red to blue, but a reddish shade of blue to a meaningful one. One that is electing representatives who are committed to representing their communities and government for of and by the people instead of for of and by our corporations.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's heavy. Just heavy. I sometimes I got to take a step back from doing this, and we're talking, and we're just like, this is heavy. The things that we're dealing with, and the fact that we've got politicians like Nancy, because you said something that for me, while I was listening to my cat bomb the audio, that you said Nancy continually stands up for the particular interests, and I realized that what she was doing was with war, not letting the troops come home. All right, which is basically causing more troops to die, causing more death and murder, more environmental damage because we like shooting uranium rounds, and she does the same thing with all the other healthcare, not letting healthcare come through because she's protecting the interests of her insurance companies, right? And it's when you put it in that sense, it's really pisses me off. I guess
she is a phenomenally successful moderate Republican,
yes,
who somehow has managed to take over the Democratic Party.
Yeah, very well said.
That simple. She's not Trumpy. She's not that kind of conservative. But put her in a room with John McCain, find the daylight there. The late senator was renowned for being a maverick because he was willing to cross the partisan aisle and embrace issues like, for instance, campaign finance reform in the early 2000s. Pelosi is the same sort, a leader of the Democratic Party who all too often is willing to embrace Republican and conservative ideas and advance them.
Right.
I don't want to overstate the case. I do think that in 2010, when the House passed a version of the Affordable Care Act that included a public option, that was a big deal, and she deserves credit for it. On the other hand, it is absolutely the aberration to a broader rule. And I think that the need to insist on accountability is one that is well established in our constitutional design. It is why we have elections in the first place. And I'm very eager to invite San Franciscans in first March 2020 in the primary, and then in the general election in November, when I have a chance to face off against the Speaker of the House, to choose a meaningful alternative.
I love that. Thank you. You're leading into what I was just going to ask. What can people do? Not only for you running against Nancy Pelosi, but also in the interest of impeachment. Is there any particular action that you think people should take that would be most effective?
Yes. Great question. I appreciate you asking it. The first most important thing I always say to people is curate your news sources and find independent news. If you're watching that program, you're already doing that. Good job. Keep it up. 2, find neighbors. When you relate to the news and politics as an atomized person, it reduces you to yelling at your screen. Maybe you can participate in social media. That matters. But what really matters is organizing, which is to say taking concerted action with your neighbors around issues of common cause. Meeting your neighbors, talking about what concerns you, finding points in common, and then having the conversation, what will we together do about this, and what can we together do that none of us alone can do? That's an incredibly important conversation to have. Everybody should have it, whether you're concerned primarily about impeachment or establishing healthcare as a human right, or establishing a robust response to the escalating climate crisis to ensure a viable future for your kids and your grandkids. Whatever your issue is, find your neighbors and talk about it. That is inescapably the most important thing across context. Specifically in the impeachment context, emboldening the wing of the party that is seeking impeachment, that is to say, backing voices online like Representative Rashida Tlaib, who's used very colorful language to suggest her support for impeachment, and challenging the centrist wing that is proving complicit with the GOP is another important component there. So I would just, offer a friendly amendment to your question. When people who might be interested in supporting our campaign to challenge the Speaker of the House for the CA-12 seat in the House, I would describe that, don't think of that as helping me. It would, obviously, but I think of that as helping us. And this is about defending our democracy, not only from a kleptocratic president, but the personified embodiment of the House of Representatives, who is not showing up for work in a very crucial way at a very crucial time. And if you do want to build the campaign challenging the speaker, forcing her hand on any of these issues, from the Green New Deal to Medicare for All to impeachment, you can visit us online at shahidforchange.us. You can support our campaign on social media by sharing, liking, commenting on our tweets, Facebook posts, and Instagram posts. You can contribute to the campaign online at shahidforchange.us. You can talk to your friends about our campaign, especially if you have friends who live here in San Francisco who you might want to refer us to. People who live here in San Francisco, we're out almost every day on the street meeting supporters. Today is our third day of actions this week. We were out Monday night at the Goldman Awards, Tuesday night at a talk at City Arts with the renowned author Bill McKibben, who was speaking with Mustafa Santiago Ali from the Hip Hop Caucus. Today we were out for International Workers' Day. Cool. Over the weekend we were out at events with the Bernie-crats and others, and we will be at events almost every day for the next year. And so people in San Francisco who want to help build the campaign can join us at any of those events or any of the private events with supporters that we're supporting and turning out at. Very eager to connect with anybody who has an interest in these issues. The supporters of our campaign certainly are coming from every part of the Bay Area and every part of San Francisco, but they're also all over the country. And I'm very excited to harness that nationwide interest in advancing an impeachment, in advancing the human right to healthcare, in advancing climate justice. And I certainly will leave no stone unturned and no ounce of energy unexpended over the next year in our quest to represent San Francisco meaningfully in the House.
That's awesome. And I'm excited about that. Full disclosure, everybody, I have volunteered personally for Shahid's campaign because I am very excited about helping to remove Nancy Pelosi. Laura has also done the same. And I don't know if Laura's got any questions?
I do. I have a question, kind of before we let you go, we're going to take a little bit more of your energy. People want to know, what does impeachment look like? What happens if Trump gets impeached? What happens? We saw what happened with Bill Clinton, which was nothing. So
good point.
What happens?
Well, it's not fair to say that nothing happened to Bill Clinton. I mean, his administration effectively was hamstrung at that point. I mean, that was the end of any point at which the Clinton administration was able to move forward a progressive agenda.
Yeah, but there's no perp walk or anything dramatic. It just seemed like he stayed in office until the end of his term.
But there's a crucial thing to grip there. It's again the veneer above the substance. He did stay in office, but what happened to his presidency? He went from being, and I think it's a little bit too cute to blame the impeachment proceeding under the Clinton administration entirely for its conservative co-optation. But the Clinton administration is renowned, frankly, for triangulation, is the word that they chose, to basically seek tactical gains by making strategic concessions, like dismantling welfare, like the Glass-Steagall reforms that basically laid the foundation for the 2008 financial crisis.
Telecommunications Act.
All these kinds of issues, right? Putting 100,000 cops on the street. There were a lot of ways in which the Clinton administration, like Nancy Pelosi, very effectively advanced a conservative agenda. Mm-hmm. And I think the point at which that happened, when it got co-opted, was impeachment. I mean, it might have left the administration in office, but it effectively transformed what it was seeking. And so the notion that somehow the attempts to impeach President Clinton backfired and the GOP paid a cost is frankly preposterous. The GOP won that struggle in every meaningful sense. And it is entirely too charitable to the subsequent history to presume that just because Bill Clinton stayed in office, that was a Democratic victory. In fact, I think that was the point when we lost the Democratic Party as a voice for working people. The Democratic Party hasn't been a labor party since the Clinton administration. How different might that be if it weren't on the ropes trying to defend its legitimacy from a quasi-judicial process in the Senate? Apply that same sort of thinking here. If the House initiated impeachment proceedings and the country gets to sit through a year of news cycles where senators like Kamala Harris, who we've seen today is a very skilled interlocutor, as you would think she would be as a former prosecutor, probably a better interlocutor in the Senate than she would be as a president. Senators could be spending the next year digging into the litany of continuing crimes of this administration, forcing those facts into the public before the American people. And if that happened, I think what we would very likely see is another wave election where Republicans would lose a bunch of seats, both in the Congress and in the Senate, both in the House and in the Senate. And I think that it also could prove very influential in ensuring the next president of the United States is Senator Bernie Sanders.
Good answer.
Not just Joe Biden? Or no?
Oof. Yeah, well, we've talked about Joe Biden.
But I mean, you said specifically Bernie Sanders, but do you think there is an advantage for Bernie in that he really isn't a part of the quagmire of all of this at all?
To some extent, I mean, I do think that the impeachment proceedings would reveal to some extent how the parties have often marched in lockstep.
Yes.
And so that would generally, I think, benefit Bernie. I think that frankly, in impeachment, the single presidential candidate who would probably be best poised to politically capitalize on impeachment proceedings, for better or worse, I think is Senator Kamala Harris, because she is on the Judiciary Committee. She would have a particular role. It would put her back in the seat of being effectively a prosecutor. She's been the chief prosecutor for the state of California and the county and city that I live in and am running to represent. She is very skilled at that job. And I think if she had a year to basically lay into administration officials and the president and his business contacts, I think it could be an incredible platform to promote her candidacy for the White House. I say that from the standpoint of someone who does not support her candidacy from the White House.
I was just going to say,
I would just note the opportunity that the process would afford her.
Well, and hopefully that would be it, because her policies certainly aren't anything we're looking for. But I guess her ability in prosecution, sure.
Exactly.
All right.
The perception of her as a strong woman, really sticking it to whoever she's interrogating is a powerful imagery for a lot of people looking for, a woman as a candidate.
I agree, but I would just note that it is merely imagery, because the other people that Kamala Harris has spent her career sticking it to are the people of California. And
right. Yeah, exactly.
Yes, particularly people of color. Is that it, question-wise?
Yeah, that was that kind of distilled it down. People just wanted to get a sense of what happens. What is the end game of an impeachment? What would that look like?
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
I think you just told us. So.
This has been fantastic, Shahid. I really appreciate the conversation. We've learned a lot. I actually really have learned a lot. I'm a little more encouraged about what could possibly happen if we put the pressure on. I want to remind everybody, we've actually seen putting the pressure on work in a number of ways. So let's not get discouraged there.
I'll name one if it's helpful. Just think about the attack on Ilhan Omar, when the very same centrist Democrats who were laying down on impeachment tried to censor a member of the Democratic caucus in favor of the Trump administration's corrupt human rights abuses and commitment to corporate resource extraction. We stopped that.
Right. We,
the progressive movement, within a week, managed to force the centrist cabal back from its original plan, and the ultimate resolution that they issued paid attention to bigotry in many different ways, rather than simply singling out a false construction of anti-Semitism rooted in construction or rooted in the criticism of a foreign government for its human rights abuses. At the end of the day, we have won recently. We will win again. I think any doom and gloom that we feel around these issues, I think it's easy to fall prey to that. As a candidate who is, all in trying to promote an alternative, I don't have the luxury of disillusion, right? I mean, I'm just full tilt at the target. And I would just invite all of us to remember that the antidotes, I've said this before, maybe on this program, there are two antidotes to despair that I know about. One is community and the other one is action. And when you have community in action, it is a regenerative exercise that will feed itself. And recognizing when you are acting in concert with your neighbors toward a common end, it is a reward in itself. And I do think that we all have those opportunities available to us, however dark the present might seem.
You have said that before to me, and it got me to volunteer for your campaign because it was a really good line.
Appreciate your help, too.
And it's true. And I just want to say to everybody out there who is like me and does not like being in public physically, community includes online, right? So
absolutely,
get with a group of people, join a Slack group, do what I did, and say, I just want to work directly with a campaign. And if you don't think you have anything to offer, that's bullshit. Everybody has something to offer. All right.
Absolutely.
So
everyone does have a great deal to offer, and sometimes it requires reminding ourselves and each other that that's true. But we all have agency.
Absolutely, absolutely. Shahid, this has been amazing. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to our next conversation.
You're kind. Likewise. Thanks so much for having me on. Keep up the great work, you guys.
Yeah. And last question.
So much. You're
always busy. You're always campaigning. Do you have any idea where you're going to be next? And if
where I'm
not,
going to be next, let me think for a second. Frankly, I'd have to look at a calendar to give you a really good answer.
the best way to find that out, though, is to follow you on social media
Yes.
because you're always posting your events. So thank you for running and for doing all the activity you're doing. You're just crazy. We always go out with music here, and so we're going to go out with a song. Everybody, this is so perfect. Marcus found this for today, and I love it. It's the Honey Drippers from 1972, Impeach
nice.
the President. You know, it kind of fits. So here we go, everybody. Thank you for being here, and
Bye,
we'll
everyone.
see you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.